The morning sun filtered through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across Judge's mahogany desk. She sat in her private chambers, reviewing the day's calendar with the same meticulous attention she'd given to thousands of cases over her 18-year reign on the bench. Her coffee had gone cold an hour ago. She barely noticed. At 56 years old, had become the most feared judge in the Knoxville family court system, not because she was cruel, but because she was relentless in her pursuit of truth and absolutely immune to manipulation. Her reputation preceded her like a storm cloud. Lawyers actually dreaded drawing her courtroom number. Parents scrambled to hire the most expensive attorneys when they learned would be hearing their case. Social workers approached her with deference bordering on fear. And yet, beneath that terrifying exterior was a woman who dedicated her entire adult life to one singular mission: protecting children by cutting through the lies that adults used to destroy each other. Hadn't always been this hard. 23 years ago, when she was a young attorney fresh from law school, she'd been idealistic. She believed in the system. She believed people would tell the truth. She believed justice would naturally emerge from honest testimony and reasonable discussion. Then came her first family court assignment, and everything changed. She watched a charming father convince the court that his wife was unstable, only to discover 5 years later that he'd been systematically abusing their daughter. She watched a manipulative mother convince authorities that her ex was dangerous, only to find out she was lying to punish him for leaving her. Case after case, year after year, she witnessed the catastrophic damage that adult lies inflicted on children who had no voice, no power, and no escape. So learned to see through deception. She developed an almost supernatural ability to detect when someone was performing rather than testifying. She recognized the subtle shift in breathing that preceded a lie. She noticed when eyes moved fractionally to the left before answering. She caught the barely perceptible tension in the jaw when someone rehearsed their story too well. Her courtroom became a place where truth had nowhere to hide because had made it her personal mission to excavate it, no matter how deeply it was buried. But there was a cost to this armor. No longer believed in sentimentality. She no longer believed that feelings solved problems, only facts did. She no longer believed that small, beautiful gestures could matter in a system built on evidence and testimony. Love was wonderful, sure. Compassion was admirable, but in her courtroom they were luxuries. What mattered was the truth, and the truth was often ugly, complicated, and impossible to extract from traumatized children who shut down emotionally when confronted with their own pain. This morning, as reviewed the custody case, she felt the familiar frustration rising in her chest. She'd read the file 3 times. Myra, age 9. Selective mutism induced by family trauma, unable to provide verbal testimony about her living situation. Both parents claiming the other was unfit. The state recommending that Myra's own words determine her living arrangement, yet Myra was apparently incapable of providing those words. It was a contradiction that made's jaw clench. And now this. Officer's email from yesterday sat in her inbox like an unwelcome guest. Judge, I'd like to request permission to bring a certified therapy dog into your courtroom for Myra's testimony. Research shows that trained dogs can significantly reduce anxiety in traumatized witnesses, particularly children. The dog would simply sit nearby, providing calming presence. No interference with proceedings. Just a chance to help a child access her own voice. Had read it once and actually laughed out loud. A dog. They were going to solve a complex psychological and legal problem with a dog. It was the kind of naive, feel-good thinking that made her want to bang her head against her desk. This was exactly the kind of sentimentality that had no place in a courtroom. Justice wasn't about feelings. Justice was about facts, evidence, testimony, and law. Adding a dog wouldn't change a single piece of evidence. It wouldn't make Myra's testimony more reliable or more true. At best, it was a distraction. At worst, it was a manipulation tactic designed to make the judge feel sympathetic to whoever was behind this ridiculous request. still had very few courtroom requests in her career. She believed in allowing evidence and arguments to be presented, even when she thought they were stupid. And technically, having a calm dog sit in the courtroom harmed no one. It wouldn't prejudice the proceedings. So this morning she'd sent a brief email back. Permission granted, but I'm warning you, if that dog becomes any kind of distraction, I'm removing it immediately. She didn't expect anything to come of it except wasted time and a wasted resource. She expected to hear Myra's silence echo through the courtroom again. She expected to see the girl freeze up the moment difficult questions were asked. She expected to end the day having to make a decision based on insufficient evidence, based on educated guesses, and based on the social worker's recommendations, which meant, realistically, that her decision would be only as good as the adults around her were wise. And had learned decades ago that adults were rarely as wise as they believed themselves to be. At 9:47 a.m. walked into her courtroom. It was already filling with people, both parents, their attorneys, social workers, court-appointed guardians, and a small, terrified-looking child in a pink dress who seemed to be folding in on herself like a piece of origami. Took her seat at the bench and called the courtroom to order with her standard opening. She didn't make eye contact with anyone. She was establishing her presence, her authority, her complete unwillingness to tolerate anything less than perfect decorum and absolute truth-telling. Then Officer entered, and his eyes widened slightly despite herself. He wasn't alone. He was accompanied by a massive German shepherd, probably 90 pounds of muscle and fur, with kind, intelligent eyes and a bearing that suggested he'd seen things. The dog wore a special vest that identified him as something official, though couldn't quite read the text from her position. Before she could stop herself, laughed, out loud, a genuine, reflexive laugh that echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. She immediately caught herself, her expression hardening. But for just a moment, everyone in the courtroom had witnessed something rare. Judge, legendary skeptic and emotional fortress, finding humor in the absurdity of the situation. "Let's begin," she said coldly, putting her glasses back on. "And let's see if your dog has any actual magic up its fur, officer." She had absolutely no idea she was about to have her entire worldview shattered by what came next. Myra had not spoken a complete sentence in exactly 6 months, 2 weeks and 3 days. She knew this because her therapist, Dr. Hayes, had marked the date on Myra's calendar, August 15th. With a small red X after that date, the calendar was filled with red X's, documenting each day of her silence like a countdown toward something terrible or miraculous. Myra wasn't sure which. The pink dress she wore today had belonged to her grandmother in Taiwan. Her abuela had sent it months ago, along with a letter written in careful English. "Myra, my beautiful girl, wear this when you feel brave. This dress remembers my mother's courage. Wear it and be strong." Myra had never met her abuela in person. She lived too far away, but she had worn the dress every night for the past month, sleeping in it because somehow it made her feel less alone in the darkness. 6 months ago, Myra had been a normal 9-year-old girl. She talked constantly, so much that her mother would sometimes say, "Myra, please give my ears a break." She loved violin lessons, though she wasn't very good. She collected stickers and had a best friend named Sophie who lived 2 houses down the street. She laughed easily. She had opinions about everything. She was, in every measurable way, a child. Then came the day her parents sat her down in the living room and told her they were getting divorced. At first, Myra thought it was temporary. Surely this was something they would fix, like when her mother and father fought about where to spend Thanksgiving, and then everything went back to normal. But it didn't go back to normal. Instead, everything fractured into pieces that didn't fit together anymore. Her father moved out on a Tuesday. On Wednesday, Myra's mother started saying things about him that made Myra's stomach hurt, comments about his irresponsibility and his new girlfriend who didn't care about children. Then her father would pick her up for the weekend and say things about her mother being angry and controlling, and using Myra as a weapon. Each parent seemed to believe Myra should take their side, should validate their version of events, should confirm that the other parent was the problem. Myra loved them both. This was the thing no one seemed to understand. She didn't want to choose. She didn't want to be used as evidence. But increasingly, that's what she was: evidence to be presented, testimony to be elicited, ammunition to be deployed in the adult war that had erupted around her. Then came the incident that changed everything. It was small, really, insignificant. On a Saturday evening at her father's apartment, his new girlfriend had made a comment about Myra's violin practice. "Your scales are kind of painful to listen to," she'd said, laughing like it was a joke. But Myra heard something underneath the laughter, contempt maybe, or dismissal, and something inside her had broken. Later that night, Myra had told her mother about's comment, but in her retelling it had become something worse. Her voice had risen with her own hurt feelings, and her mother had interpreted it as evidence of mistreatment. Her mother had called a lawyer. A social worker had been assigned. Questions had been asked. Everyone was suddenly very concerned about whether Myra was safe at her father's house. Myra had tried to explain that hadn't meant to hurt her feelings, that it was just a comment, that her father had been nothing but kind. But by then, the machinery had started. Once the state got involved, once lawyers started talking, once people started believing they had to protect her, there was no way to stop it. And somewhere in the middle of all this investigation and questioning and concern, Myra had simply stopped talking. It wasn't a conscious decision. She didn't wake up one morning and decide that silence was her strategy. It just happened. She opened her mouth one day and nothing came out. Words had started to feel dangerous. Every word she said was being recorded, analyzed, used as evidence. Her words were being twisted. Her feelings were being weaponized. Her voice, which she'd once used so freely, had become a dangerous thing. So she stopped. Her teachers noticed first. Myra went from raising her hand constantly in class to sitting in perfect silence. She communicated through written notes and gentle head shakes. Her parents argued about it. Her mother thought it was trauma from being at her father's house. Her father thought it was manipulation caused by her mother's accusations. Both of them were terrified. Both of them blamed the other. Dr. Hayes, the child psychologist assigned to her case, had diagnosed it as selective mutism, an anxiety disorder where children literally cannot speak in certain situations, even when they desperately want to. Dr. Hayes had been kind. She didn't force Myra to talk. She let Myra draw pictures and write things down and communicate however she could. Over the months, a fragile trust had developed. "You're safe with me," Dr. Hayes would say. "In this room, whatever you say won't be used against you or your parents. This is just for you." Slowly, Myra had begun to speak again, but only to Dr. Hayes, only in that safe room, only when the door was closed. Anywhere else, her voice simply disappeared. Now, sitting in the courthouse hallway an hour before her testimony, Myra's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Today she would have to speak again. Not just to Dr. Hayes, to lawyers, to a judge, to her parents, to strangers, and whatever she said would determine her entire future. Her father loved her, she knew this. He wanted her to live with him. He'd done nothing wrong, but she couldn't say that because then her mother would feel rejected. Her mother loved her too, desperate, messy, fierce love that sometimes scared Myra. But Myra couldn't say that her mother's anger frightened her sometimes, because then she'd be taking her father's side. There was no safe answer. There was no words that wouldn't hurt someone she loved. Dr. Hayes sat beside her in the hallway, holding her hand. She was wearing the same kind, concerned expression she always wore, but Myra could feel the tension in her grip. Dr. Hayes was worried too. Everyone was worried. The weight of all that worry from her parents, from the social workers, from the court system itself, pressed down on Myra's small shoulders like a physical force. "You can do this," Dr. Hayes whispered. "Just tell the truth. That's all anyone is asking for, the truth in your own words." But Myra's own words felt like they didn't belong to her anymore. They felt like they belonged to lawyers and judges and systems that had learned to extract them and use them as weapons. She looked down at the pink dress, her abuela's dress, the dress that was supposed to remember courage. And in her chest, underneath all the fear and anxiety, something tiny stirred, a memory of her own voice, a memory of when she wasn't afraid to use it. Maybe, she thought, maybe today she could try. The bailiff appeared in the hallway. "Myra, we're ready for you." Dr. Hayes squeezed her hand one more time. And Myra, dressed in her abuela's pink dress, stood up on shaky legs and walked toward the courtroom, toward the judge, toward the moment that would change everything. She had no idea that a dog was waiting for her inside. Officer James had received the call at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night in April. He'd been sitting on his porch, drinking a beer, watching the Tennessee sun disappear behind the mountains. The number was his veterinarian's personal line, not a good sign when your vet calls at that hour. "It's Max," doctor had said without preamble. "He came in limping this afternoon. I've done the x-rays. It's advanced arthritis in both rear legs. I'm sorry, James. I know how much he means to you." Had hung up the phone and sat there for a long time, not moving. For 12 years, Max had been more than a partner. He was a brother, a friend, a reason to get up in the morning. They'd started together when Max was just a pup, 8 weeks old and full of chaotic energy. Had trained him from the ground up, pouring thousands of hours into teaching him discipline, focus, and the complex skills of police work. And Max had thrived. He was a natural. His drug detection rate was exceptional. His ability to track missing persons was legendary within the department. He'd apprehended violent suspects who would have otherwise escaped. He'd found a missing 3-year-old girl who'd wandered into the woods near her home, found her alive and unharmed because Max's nose was better than any GPS system humans could invent. That little girl had hugged Max's face and had cried for the first time in 15 years. But bodies wear out, even the best bodies, even loyal bodies that never complained and never asked for anything except food, water, and the chance to work. Max's rear legs had been bothering him for months, realized in hindsight. He'd noticed the slight hesitation when Max jumped into the squad car, the way he favored his right side when they ran. He'd ignored it because acknowledging it meant admitting what was coming. Retirement, the end of an era, the end of Max's working life. Had spent weeks in a depression he didn't bother hiding from anyone. He'd come to work and performed his duties adequately but without passion. He'd stopped volunteering for extra shifts. He'd gone through the motions of being a police officer while his heart broke into pieces every single day because Max, his Max, was now spending 12 hours a day lying on an orthopedic bed, his magnificent body betraying him, his purpose seemingly evaporating. That's when his captain had called him into the office. "I heard about Max," Captain had said without sitting down, leaning against his desk with the casualness of someone who'd learned not to waste time with preamble. "I also heard you're falling apart." Hadn't it? What was the point? "There's a program," the captain had continued. "It's new, experimental, called Courtroom Calm. Researchers are looking into the therapeutic effects of trained dogs on traumatized witnesses. They believe a dog's presence can reduce anxiety and help people access their own memories more effectively." Had looked up. Max isn't. "Listen to me," had interrupted. "Max has been a working dog his entire life. His identity is wrapped up in having a job, having a purpose. You know this. I know this. Putting him out to pasture to slowly decay in your backyard isn't kindness, it's cruelty disguised as comfort." The words had hit like a physical blow because they were true. He'd been thinking about Max's comfort without considering Max's actual nature. Max was a dog who needed purpose, a dog who thrived on work, a dog who, even with arthritis, would rather have a job than live a life of idle comfort. "They need people interested in the program," had said. "People with dogs who have the right temperament, dogs that can read people, dogs that care." He'd paused. Max is one of the best I've ever seen, and you're one of the best handlers I've ever known. Maybe this is his next mission. Had sat with that idea for 3 days before contacting the program director, Doctor, a clinical psychologist who'd pioneered the therapeutic dog initiative. They'd met at a coffee shop and had brought Max, who'd immediately gone to sleep at its feet, a sign of complete trust and comfort. Doctor had watched Max carefully. Then he'd asked to leave the room, had felt like he was betraying his partner, but through the window, he'd watched Doctor sit on the floor next to Max. The old dog had lifted his head and something had passed between them, some kind of understanding. After 5 minutes, Doctor had come back outside. "He's perfect," had said simply. "Does he have the ability to read distressed people?" "All the time," had replied. "He knows when I'm upset before I know it myself. He knows when people are scared." "That's what we need," had said. "Not an aggressive, alert dog, not a service dog trained for specific tasks, just a presence, a being who can sit with someone in their pain and transmit safety through his presence alone." The training had been entirely different from police work. Instead of learning to detect drugs or explosives, Max had learned to be still, to be calm, to sit near distressed people without reacting to their emotions, to transmit, through his sheer existence, that safety was possible even in scary situations. And here's what had surprised everyone: Max loved it. The arthritis was still there. He'd never run at full speed again. He'd never make a dramatic apprehension. But 3 times a week would drive him to courthouses and office buildings where traumatized people needed to tell their stories. And Max would lie down beside them and be present with them. And somehow, his presence made the telling easier. This morning, sitting in his truck outside the courthouse with Max beside him, his hands were shaking. Not because he was nervous, he wasn't, but because he understood what was about to happen. This case was important. This girl, Myra, was terrified. And Judge Legend had it that she was one of the most skeptical people in the entire Tennessee court system. She didn't believe in shortcuts. She didn't believe in sentiment. She would believe Max needed to prove something. Looked over at his partner. Max's eyes were closed, but his ears were alert. He knew where they were. He knew what was coming. And despite his advanced age and his broken body, despite the limp that would never fully go away, Max seemed to understand that his job mattered. That this job, not the drug busts or the dramatic arrests, but sitting quietly with a frightened child, this job was exactly what he was meant to do. "Ready, buddy," whispered. Max opened one eye and looked at his handler. And in that look was 12 years of partnership, of trust, of unconditional love. Of a dog who'd spent his entire life serving, and who'd found a new way to serve when his body told him the old ways were no longer possible. Reached over and scratched behind Max's ears, the same ritual they'd performed before countless police operations. "Let's go change a life," he said. They exited the truck together, a retired police dog and his handler, walking toward a courtroom where a judge was about to have her entire worldview tested, where a terrified girl was about to learn that sometimes the most powerful force in the world wasn't authority or evidence or legal procedure. Sometimes it was just quiet, loyal presence. Sometimes it was a dog who'd learned that the greatest work of his life wasn't catching criminals. It was helping broken people find their voice again. The courtroom was colder than Myra had expected. She'd imagined it would be like the classrooms at school or the waiting room at Dr. Hayes' office, warm, familiar, safe. Instead, it felt like the inside of a refrigerator. Everything was marble and wood and echoing emptiness. The high ceilings made her feel impossibly small. The fluorescent lights made her feel exposed, like she was an insect pinned under a microscope. Judge sat at her elevated bench like a stern goddess presiding over mortals below. Even though she was now approximately 60 feet away, Myra could feel the weight of her attention. This woman had laughed earlier. Myra had heard it, that sharp, dismissive laugh when the police officer brought in Max. It had sounded like contempt. It had sounded like, I don't believe in this nonsense." Max lay at the edge of the witness box, as still and calm as a sculpture. Officer sat in the gallery behind him, his face showing nothing, but Myra could see his hands were clenched on his thighs. He was nervous too. At least she wasn't alone in that. Her father sat on one side of the courtroom with his lawyer, a sharp-featured woman named Ms. Her mother sat on the opposite side with a different lawyer, a man with kind eyes who kept glancing at Myra with visible concern. Between them, representing Myra's interests, was a court-appointed guardian named Mr. David Torres. He'd met with Myra twice. He seemed nice, but he was still a stranger, and Myra had already learned that strangers were not safe. They were variables in an equation that could rearrange her entire life without her consent. The bailiff guided Myra to the witness stand. Each step felt like walking through water. Her legs didn't want to cooperate. There was a Bible on the stand, and the bailiff asked if she would swear to tell the truth. Myra nodded. Speaking an oath felt too formal, too scary. A nod was safer. Judge's expression remained unchanged, cold, neutral, professional. She gave no indication that she saw a terrified 9-year-old girl. She saw a witness, a source of information, a tool for extracting truth. Myra could feel the difference in how she was being looked at compared to how Dr. Hayes looked at her. Dr. Hayes looked like she cared. Judge looked like she was performing a job. Mr. Torres went first, as Myra's guardian. His questions were designed to be gentle, to establish her baseline, to create a foundation of safe testimony before moving into dangerous territory. "Myra, can you tell us your full name?" "Myra," she whispered. Her voice sounded strange in her own ears, thin, fragile, like it might shatter if she spoke any louder. "And how old are you?" "9. What grade are you in?" "4th grade. These questions were easy. These were facts. These didn't require her to choose sides or betray anyone. She could answer these. Then one of the lawyers, Ms., her father's attorney, took over. Her approach was different, still gentle, still careful, but with an undertone of direction. She was trying to guide Myra's testimony toward particular conclusions. "Myra, can you tell us about your living arrangement with your father?" Myra's throat tightened. Here it was, the dangerous question. She started, then nothing came. She opened her mouth again, still nothing. The room waited. She could feel everyone's eyes on her, her parents watching intently, the social workers taking notes, the judge observing with that cold, analytical gaze. "Take your time," Ms. said gently. "There's no rush. Can you describe what your father's apartment looks like?" Myra tried. She really did. She opened her mouth to talk about the living room and the kitchen and her bedroom where she'd painted stars on the walls. But somewhere between her brain and her voice, the words disappeared. It was like there was a barrier between her thoughts and her ability to express them. The more she tried to push through, the more solid the barrier became. Her hands started to shake. She gripped the edge of the witness box, her small fingers barely reaching around the polished wood. "Are you okay?" Ms. asked, and there was concern in her voice now. But concern wasn't enough. Concern couldn't unlock her voice. Judge leaned forward slightly. "Drink some water, Ms.," she said, her tone making clear that this was not a suggestion, it was a command. There was water at the stand. Myra's hands trembled so badly she could barely lift the glass without spilling it. The water helped slightly. She took a breath. "Your Honor, if I may," Mr. Torres interjected. "Myra experiences selective mutism when she's anxious. She's not being uncooperative. She's experiencing a genuine psychological response to stress." Judge's eyes flickered toward Max, and Myra saw something cross her face. Skepticism, resignation, perhaps a hint of contempt. The judge clearly believed that this was exactly the kind of excuse-making she'd warned against. A child who wouldn't talk wasn't a victim in need of accommodation. She was a failure in the system, and no dog was going to change that. The questioning continued, and it was excruciating. Each question required Myra to make herself vulnerable. Each question felt like a test where wrong answers would destroy her family. Ms. asked about her relationship with her father, about whether she felt safe at his apartment, about her father's girlfriend. Myra managed monosyllabic answers. Yes, safe, she's okay, but the effort was destroying her. Her chest felt tight, she couldn't get enough air. Her vision was starting to blur at the edges. Then her mother's attorney took his turn. His questions were phrased differently. They were designed to suggest that her mother's concerns were valid. Do you ever feel scared at your father's house? Has anyone there ever said things that hurt your feelings? Would you feel more comfortable living with your mother? With each question, Myra's silence grew deeper. It wasn't that she didn't want to answer. It was that every possible answer was a betrayal. If she said yes to feeling scared, she'd hurt her father. If she said no, she'd hurt her mother. If she said she wanted to live with her father would be devastated. If she said she wanted to live with her mother would feel rejected. There was no correct answer. There was only the impossible task of speaking, while every word carried the weight of potential destruction. After about 20 minutes, Judge raised her hand. "I think we need to take a recess," she said flatly. "The witness is clearly unable to provide coherent testimony." Unable, the word hung in the air like a death sentence. Myra had failed. The system had tried and she'd failed it. As she stepped down from the witness stand, tears streaming down her face, her eyes caught Max's gaze. The dog was watching her, his expression unchanged, his body still relaxed. But there was something in his eyes, not judgment, not disappointment, just understanding, like he knew what it felt like to be asked to do something that felt impossible. Judge was already making notes, probably preparing to render a decision based on insufficient evidence, based on what the adults in the room wanted rather than what Myra needed. The mounting tension broke into something worse, despair. The judge looked at Officer with an expression that clearly said, "I told you this was a waste of time." And no one knew what was about to happen next. The recess lasted 15 minutes. 15 minutes in which Myra sat in a small room with Dr. Hayes, trying to breathe through the panic that had seized her chest. She was hyperventilating, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. Dr. Hayes was rubbing her back in slow circles, whispering, "You're safe. You're okay. Your body is reacting to stress, but you are safe." But Myra didn't feel safe. She felt like she'd failed the one thing that mattered. She felt like the judge had already decided, like her silence had already spoken volumes, and those volumes had said, "This girl is broken. This girl cannot be trusted to know her own mind. This girl's testimony is worthless." In the hallway outside the recess room, she could hear her mother crying. On the other side of the corridor, she could hear her father arguing with his lawyer about what to do next. Both parents loved her. Both parents were terrified, and their terror was making everything worse. When the bailiff came to collect her, Myra's legs felt like they belonged to someone else. She moved mechanically, Dr. Hayes' hand on her shoulder, back toward the courtroom, back toward the judge who'd laughed at the idea of a dog being helpful, back toward an impossible situation. Judge was already at her bench, reviewing papers. The courtroom was filling again. Lawyers, social workers, her parents, the court reporter with her stenotype machine, ready to document whatever came next. Officer sat with Max, who was still lying on the floor in exactly the same position he'd been in before the recess. The dog hadn't moved. He'd simply waited. Myra climbed back into the witness stand. Her legs felt hollow. Her throat felt like it had closed permanently. Judge looked at her over her glasses. "Ms., I understand you're having difficulty providing testimony. Do you understand that your testimony is important to this proceeding?" Myra nodded. She understood perfectly. That was the problem. "We're going to try again," the judge said. "It wasn't a suggestion." And that's when it happened. Max stood up. There had been no command. Officer hadn't signaled anything. The dog simply rose to his feet, his old joints cracking slightly with the movement. He turned his head and looked directly at Myra, not at Officer, not at the judge, at Myra. For a moment, everything else faded away. There was just Myra and Max and the look passing between them, a look that seemed to say, "I see you. I know this is hard, but you're not alone." Then Max moved. It was a slow, deliberate walk. A dog who was too old to hurry, who moved with the caution of someone whose body had seen too much. He crossed the courtroom. It felt like it took an eternity, and stopped directly in front of the witness stand. He looked up at Myra, and without any further prompting, without any training cue, Max simply rested his head on Myra's lap. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Myra froze. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The dog's head was warm and heavy on her legs, and it was the thing that had happened in this entire nightmare of legal proceedings. Not a stranger, not a system, not a betrayal waiting to happen. Just a living, breathing creature who had chosen her, who had decided that she needed help. Slowly, trembling, Myra lowered her hand and placed it on Max's head. Her fingers sank into his fur. It was coarse and warm and alive. She held on like he was the only solid thing in a world that had become entirely liquid and unstable. She looked down at his face. Max's eyes were closed, but his expression was peaceful, content even, like he'd made a decision and carried it out perfectly, like this was exactly where he was meant to be. And something shifted inside Myra. The barrier that had locked her voice disappeared. Not completely, not yet, but enough. Enough that she could feel a possibility opening up inside her chest, a possibility that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to figure this out alone. Judge had removed her glasses. She was staring at the scene, the elderly dog and the young girl, connected through nothing but presence and need. The judge's expression had changed completely. The skepticism was gone. The coldness had evaporated. What remained was something raw and honest, a human being witnessing something she couldn't quite explain but couldn't deny was real. Officer's eyes were wet. Myra's mother was crying, but differently than before. Not the angry, frightened tears from the hallway, but something gentler. Her father had placed his hand over his mouth. The court reporter had stopped typing. Even the lawyers seemed to recognize that they were witnessing something that transcended legal procedure, something that existed outside the normal rules and protocols of the courtroom. "Let's try again," Judge said quietly. Her voice had changed too. Gone was the authority, the coldness, the performance of judicial power. What remained was a woman speaking to another human being. "Whenever you're ready, Ms., in your own time." Myra took a breath. Max's weight on her lap was grounding. His presence was permission. His existence. This old dog who had lived a full life and was now choosing to use his final years in service. His existence somehow made it possible for her to be brave. "I love my dad," Myra said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was there. It was real. It belonged to her. Ms., her father's attorney, leaned forward slightly. But before she could say anything, Myra continued. "But I was scared sometimes at his apartment," she said. And then, addressing the impossible directly, "Not because of Dad, because of the arguing. I didn't want to choose. I don't want to choose. I love my mom too, even when she's angry. I just want them to stop being angry so I don't have to be scared anymore." She paused, her hand never leaving Max's head. "Didn't mean to hurt my feelings. That was just a comment. But everything felt like it mattered so much, like I was supposed to make it mean something about whether I was safe. And I felt like I had to tell on everyone, or else bad things would happen to me or to them, and I didn't know what to do." Her words were coming faster now, spilling out like water through a broken dam. "I want to live somewhere safe. I want my parents to not be so angry. I want to go to violin lessons even though I'm not very good. And I want Max to come live with me because he makes me feel like I'm not crazy for being scared." Judge was writing, but slowly, carefully, as if trying to capture not just the words but the spirit of what was being said. This wasn't just testimony now. This was a child speaking her own truth for the first time in 6 months. And it was happening because a dog had decided that she didn't have to do it alone. Max remained perfectly still, his head on Myra's lap, his presence a bridge between a terrified girl and the possibility of being heard, truly heard, by the adults who held her future in their hands. In that moment in that courtroom, everything changed. Not because the law changed, not because the system was suddenly perfect, but because one creature had chosen connection over protocol, presence over procedure, and in doing so, he'd given a girl permission to reclaim her own voice. Judge had built her emotional fortress one brick at a time, over 18 years, beginning the day she learned that truth alone was not enough to protect anyone. That day had been in 1997. She'd been a young attorney, 23 years old, fresh from law school with her idealism still intact. She'd been assigned to represent a 7-year-old boy in a custody dispute. His father had been charming and articulate. He'd told moving stories about loving his son. He'd cried during the testimony. He'd painted himself as a devoted parent wrongly accused by a vindictive ex-wife. Had believed him. The judge had believed him. The system had believed him. 3 years later, the boy had attempted suicide. He was found hanging from a belt in his bedroom closet by his older sister. He'd survived, but barely. The subsequent investigation revealed that his father had been systematically molesting him for years. The charming exterior had been a mask covering horror. Had never fully recovered from that moment. She'd learned that believing in people was dangerous, that empathy could be weaponized, that the system she'd entered to protect the vulnerable could just as easily be used to harm them. From that day forward, she'd made a decision. She would never again let emotion cloud her judgment. She would build a wall so high and so thick that nothing, not tears, not desperation, not stories, could penetrate it. That wall had served her well. It had kept her safe. It had kept her effective. Her rulings were based on facts, evidence, and law, not on the performance of grief that everyone in her courtroom seemed to specialize in. Lawyers grew to hate her because they couldn't manipulate her with emotional appeals. But her conviction rate was extraordinary. Her reversals were rare. Her decisions held up on appeal. But there was a cost to that wall. Over 18 years had stopped seeing people. She saw cases. She saw problems to be solved. She saw witnesses and litigants and social workers and experts, but she'd stopped actually seeing the humans behind those roles. She'd stopped recognizing that beneath every legal dispute was a person in pain. She trained herself to ignore the suffering because acknowledging it meant admitting that her system, the system she'd devoted her life to, couldn't actually heal what it claimed to care about. Then Max had walked across her courtroom. Had been reviewing documents when she'd noticed the motion out of the corner of her eye, a dog standing, a dog moving. It had been such an ordinary thing, an animal doing what animals do, but something about it had broken through her focus. She'd looked up. And she'd watched. Max had crossed the courtroom with the purposeful slowness of an elderly being who'd learned to accept his own limitations. He'd approached the terrified girl, and without any command, any training cue, any external prompt whatsoever, he'd made a choice. He'd placed his head on that child's lap. And in that moment, his entire wall had begun to crack. She'd watched the girl's transformation. She'd felt something move inside her chest, something she'd thought was permanently frozen. A feeling, an actual feeling which she'd been so carefully trained to ignore. What was this dog doing? He wasn't following procedure. He wasn't enforcing law. He wasn't maintaining professional distance. He was simply being present with another being who was suffering, and that presence was somehow more powerful than anything had ever witnessed in her courtroom. Had removed her glasses without meaning to. She'd realized she was crying, actually crying, silently, tears streaming down her face, without permission from her own mind. Her hands were trembling as she wrote. She'd spent 18 years believing that sentiment was weakness. That compassion was a liability. That distance was the only way to remain objective. And then a retired police dog had shown her something else entirely. That presence wasn't weak. That choosing to sit with someone in their pain wasn't a failure of professional distance. It was the highest form of professionalism possible. Because what good was justice if it didn't include compassion? What good was ruling correctly if the ruling was delivered without recognizing the human suffering beneath it? What good was her entire career if it had turned her into someone who could watch a child break and respond with skepticism instead of humanity? Had been so afraid of being fooled that she'd fooled herself into believing she was above emotion, so determined not to repeat the mistake of the charming father that she'd, building a system where she no longer even tried to see people clearly. She'd created a courtroom where testimony was extracted without care for the person providing it, where rulings were handed down without consideration for the humanity of those affected. This dog had walked into her courtroom and dismantled 18 years of armor in approximately 1 minute and 47 seconds. Officer was watching her, saw it out of the corner of her vision, the officer noticing that the judge was crying, the officer understanding, without words being exchanged, that something fundamental had shifted. That judge, legendary for her ice-cold professionalism, had been touched by something beyond her carefully constructed defenses. Myra's voice was still flowing. The girl was speaking, finally speaking, and was writing down every word not because she was a judge performing her function, but because she was a human being witnessing another human being finding her voice, and she wanted to preserve it. She wanted to honor it. She looked at the girl's face and saw something she'd trained herself not to see for 18 years. A child, not a case, not evidence, not a problem to be solved. A child, a human being, a person who'd been terrified and alone and had somehow found the courage to speak her truth because a dog had decided that she didn't have to do it alone. Thought about the boy she'd failed, the boy who'd been so expertly deceived that a charming lie had seemed more real than his own suffering. She thought about all the children who'd come through her courtroom over the years, all the cases she'd ruled on, all the times she'd been so focused on being objective that she'd failed to be humane. She couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, she could change the future. Maybe she didn't have to choose between being effective and being compassionate. Maybe that was a false choice she'd constructed in her own mind. Maybe, she thought, watching Max's steady presence ground the girl's testimony, maybe the most important tool in a courtroom wasn't logic or law or procedure. Maybe it was the willingness to see another person clearly and hold space for their truth. Her wall didn't crumble. Walls that old and that thick don't crumble completely, but it cracked, deep, irreparable cracks that would never fully close. Light poured through those cracks, and with the light came something had worked very hard to avoid: hope. Hope that she could be more than what she'd become. Hope that her work didn't have to be cold to be effective. Hope that there might be another way to seek justice that didn't require her to stop being human. Judge continued writing her notes, but her handwriting was different now. Softer, more careful, more aware. She was no longer a machine rendering judgments. She was a woman bearing witness to something sacred, a child learning that she could be heard, that she could speak her truth, that the world contained room for both her love for both parents and her need for safety. And she was part of creating that room, not by ruling correctly, but by finally, allowing herself to see. Myra had forgotten what her own voice sounded like. For 6 months, she'd rehearsed words in her head 1,000 times but never spoke them aloud. She'd practiced conversations in the shower, in bed at night, in the car on the way to therapy. But her voice had remained trapped inside her, locked behind the barrier that had grown up between her mind and her body. Now, with Max's head on her lap and his warm, steady presence anchoring her, she found that barrier dissolving. Not completely. The fear was still there. The awareness that every word might matter enormously was still there. But underneath it all was something new, the knowledge that she didn't have to figure this out alone. "Tell us about your father's apartment," Ms. prompted gently. She seemed to understand that she was witnessing something delicate. The lawyer's usual aggressive tone had softened. Myra took a breath. Max's fur rose and fell beneath her hand. "Dad's apartment is nice," she said, her voice still soft but becoming more steady. "It's small, but he made my room really special. There's a window seat where I can read. He painted the walls pale blue because that's my favorite color. And we have this bookshelf where we keep all the books we read together." As she spoke, she could feel the story taking shape. The details that she'd rehearsed in her head were finally finding their way into the world, and something miraculous was happening. Speaking the truth wasn't as dangerous as she'd feared. "Does your father make you feel safe?" the attorney asked. Myra hesitated. This was the tricky part, the part where she had to speak about her feelings without it becoming ammunition. "He makes me feel safe," she said carefully. "Most of the time, he's kind to me. He helps me with homework. He reads to me at night. She paused, her hand tightening in Max's fur. "He listens to me. When I talk, he actually listens. He doesn't just wait for his turn to talk like grown-ups usually do." On the other side of the courtroom, Myra's father's face crumpled. He was crying silently, his shoulders shaking. Myra saw it and she felt a twist of guilt, but she kept going. This was her truth. This part was her truth, and it needed to be said. "But there were scary things too," she continued, her voice becoming quieter. "Not because of Dad, because of the situation. Everything felt so important, like everything I said was going to change things. And I didn't understand what was happening, and nobody was explaining it to me properly. They just kept asking questions and taking notes, and I felt like I was supposed to say the right thing to make everyone happy, but I didn't know what the right thing was." Judge was writing, but she was also watching Myra's face. Really watching her, not just listening to words. "What about Mr. Torres?" Myra's guardian asked. "Your father's girlfriend." Myra had been dreading this question. This was the incident that had started everything. But now, with Max beside her, it felt possible to tell the truth about it. "Is okay," Myra said. "She doesn't live with us all the time, but when she's there, it's different. Dad acts different. He's trying harder, like he wants to show her that he's a good dad. And I think she probably likes me, but she doesn't really know how to talk to kids. One time she said my violin practice sounded bad, and it hurt my feelings because I know I'm not very good, but hearing her say it made it feel like she didn't think I belonged there." Myra paused, her voice becoming smaller. "But I told my mom about it, and I think I made it sound worse than it was, because I was upset. And my mom got really upset, and then it became this big thing. And I didn't mean for it to become a big thing. Was just being honest. She probably didn't mean to hurt me." Her mother's attorney shifted in his seat, probably realizing that this testimony wasn't going to support her the way they'd hoped. Myra's mother looked stricken. But Myra wasn't done. She had more truth to tell. And now that she'd started, it was like all the dammed-up words were rushing out, desperate to finally be heard. "I love my mom," Myra said, and her voice became stronger as she said this. "She loves me so much, sometimes too much. She gets so angry, and I think the anger is because she loves me and she's scared something bad will happen to me. But when she gets angry, it scares me. I feel like I have to protect her from being more upset. So I started telling her things about Dad, things that I thought she wanted to hear, because I thought if I said the right things, she would stop being so angry." On the other side of the courtroom, Myra's mother's face was covered in her hands. Her lawyer was touching her arm, trying to offer comfort. "But then the more I told her things, the more everything got bigger," Myra continued. "And I realized I'd made it so complicated that I couldn't fix it. And I got so scared that I couldn't even talk about it anymore. My voice just stopped working." She looked up at Judge. "I think they both love me, but I think they're also kind of fighting each other, using me. And I don't want to be used. I just want everyone to stop being so angry. I want my dad to be happy. I want my mom to be happy, and I want to not be scared all the time." The courtroom was completely silent. Even the court reporter had paused her typing, though she resumed when she realized Myra was still speaking. "I want to live somewhere safe and stable," Myra said. "I think my dad's apartment is safe. And I think I need to see my mom too, but maybe not as much, because when I see her, I feel the anger underneath everything, and it makes me nervous. And I think they both need to maybe talk to someone about being angry, like how I talked to Dr. Hayes about being scared." Max shifted slightly, and Myra felt his tail move against her leg. She continued, her voice steadier now. "I don't want people to be mean about my mom because I love her. But I also don't want to live with the feeling that everything depends on me saying the right thing, because that's too much responsibility for a 9-year-old. She paused and looked directly at her mother, then at her father. "I want to live with Dad, but I want to see Mom at least on weekends, if she can be less angry. And I want both of them to maybe get help, because they both seem really sad underneath all the fighting." And then in a small voice, "And I want Max to be able to visit me, because he made me brave enough to say all this, and I don't want to forget what that feels like." Officer was openly crying now. Judge had stopped writing and was simply listening, tears streaming down her face. Myra had been speaking for 22 minutes without stopping. For the first time in 6 months, a terrified girl had reclaimed her voice, not because she'd been forced, not because the system had extracted it, but because one old dog had simply decided that she deserved to be witnessed, that her words mattered, that she was worth sitting with in the darkness. And in finding her voice, Myra had given the courtroom something far more valuable than testimony. She'd given it truth, raw, complicated, beautiful human truth. The kind of truth that changes everything. 3 weeks later, Judge sat in her chambers and wrote what would become the most important ruling of her 18-year career on the bench. But unlike her previous rulings, this one was about far more than the family's custody arrangement. She'd spent the past 3 weeks in a state of reflection that bordered on spiritual transformation. She'd gone home every night and looked at her walls, the walls she'd built so carefully, the walls that were now so thoroughly cracked. She'd thought about the boy from 1997. She'd wondered if different judicial choices, made with both rigor and compassion, might have changed different outcomes. The ruling began with the standard legal language: custody determinations, visitation schedules, child support calculations. These were the mechanics of her job, but then she deviated from standard format. She wrote about selective mutism and childhood trauma. She wrote about the limitations of adversarial legal proceedings when it came to protecting vulnerable witnesses. She wrote about the therapeutic value of what she'd witnessed in her own courtroom, and she wrote about Max. The presence of Officer, retired police dog Max, during the minor's testimony appears to have facilitated psychological safety sufficient to allow the witness to overcome anxiety-induced speech impediment and provide coherent, emotionally authentic testimony. The witness was able to express complex emotional truths that would not have been accessible through traditional interrogation. This court finds that such presence should not be dismissed as sentiment or courtroom theatricality, but rather recognized as a legitimate therapeutic intervention with measurable outcomes. She concluded with a formal recommendation. This court respectfully submits to the Tennessee State Appellate Court system that therapeutic animal presence be examined as a potential accommodation for vulnerable witnesses in family court proceedings. The therapeutic value demonstrated in this case suggests that what was previously dismissed as emotional manipulation may, in fact, represent a more accurate and humane pathway to truth. The ruling distributed to the media almost immediately. Within 48 hours, it had been picked up by state news outlets. Within a week, it was being discussed in legal journals and on social media. People were sharing Max's photo. People were questioning their entire approach to child testimony. Judge became a spokesperson for the initiative, something she'd never sought but couldn't refuse. She gave interviews. She spoke at judicial conferences. She wrote op-eds about the intersection of compassion and justice. And everywhere she went, people wanted to hear about Max and Myra. What she didn't share publicly was her own transformation. That was too personal, too vulnerable. But privately, she'd started therapy with a psychologist who specialized in professional trauma and burnout. She'd talked, for the first time in 18 years, about the boy from 1997 and the ways his story had calcified inside her. Her therapist had said something that stuck with her. You built a wall to protect yourself, but you ended up imprisoning yourself. Now, gradually, carefully, she was learning to live with the cracks. Myra's life changed too, though more quietly. The custody arrangement Judge approved gave Myra primary residence with her father, with scheduled visitation with her mother every weekend and Wednesday evenings. But the court also mandated family therapy for both parents, separate sessions initially, then joint sessions once they'd done the individual work to understand how their conflict had harmed their daughter. Myra's father's girlfriend agreed to attend parenting classes. It was a small gesture, but it mattered. She was learning how to interact with a child, how to understand that careless comments could carry weight. Within 6 months, she'd become genuinely connected to Myra, not out of obligation to her father, but out of her own growth. Myra's mother, Lily, had the hardest journey. The anger that had driven so much of her litigation wasn't just about her custody dispute. It was about her own trauma, her own abandonment fears, her own need to control what felt uncontrollable. Working through that in therapy was grueling, but she did the work. She committed to it. And slowly, her relationship with her daughter transformed from desperate and angry to genuinely loving in a way that didn't require Myra to manage her emotions. 1 year after the ruling, Myra's father, Thomas, and her mother, Lily, were able to sit down together with Dr. Hayes for a joint session where they apologized to Myra. Not performative apologies, real ones. "I'm sorry I was so angry all the time," Lily said. "You were never supposed to fix things between us. That was my job as an adult and I failed you. I hope you can forgive me." Thomas added, "I should have protected you better from all of this. I got caught up in the legal fight and forgot that you were getting hurt in the middle of it. I'm sorry for that." And Myra, no longer afraid, no longer silent, told them, "I forgive you. I love you both. But I'm never going to do that again. I'm never going to try to manage your emotions or fix your problems. That's too much for me." Both parents nodded. They understood. And in that understanding was the beginning of a healthier family dynamic. Officer and Max became famous. They were invited to schools, to law enforcement conferences, to speaking engagements. Max became the face of a movement toward therapeutic animal presence in courtrooms. By the end of the year, 12 Tennessee courthouses had adopted similar programs. By the end of the second year, 5 neighboring states had implemented their own versions. Max, now in his twilight years, became a celebrity. Kids wanted to pet him. People wanted to hear his story. Officer, who'd feared retirement as the end of purpose, found that his true purpose had only just begun. But the greatest gift came in a simpler form. Every month, Myra visited Max at the police station. She'd bring books she was reading and sit with the old dog, who spent most of his time now resting but whose eyes would light up when he saw her. She'd tell him about school, about violin lessons, she was getting better, about her reconciliation with both parents. One afternoon, as Myra sat with her hand on Max's head, she said, "You know what you did for me? You showed me that it's okay to need help, that there's no shame in having someone sit with you when things are hard, that you don't have to figure everything out alone." Max's tail thumped against the floor. "I'm going to be a therapist," she added, "or maybe a social worker, something where I can help kids like me, kids who get caught in adult problems and don't know how to speak up for themselves." Officer, who'd been pretending not to listen from across the room, felt his throat tighten. Judge received news of Myra's aspiration and felt something shift inside her. This was legacy. Not the ruling, though that mattered. Not the media attention, though that had its place. Real legacy was a child who'd been broken and silenced, being given the tools to help other broken, silenced children. She started a scholarship fund for social work students. She continued her advocacy work. And she began each day differently than she had before, not with armor but with intentionality, with the commitment to see people clearly and hold space for their truth. She kept the photograph on her bench exactly as she described it would be. Myra's small hand buried in Max's fur, two souls meeting in the darkness, changing everything. But the most important photograph, the one she kept in her home office where only she could see it, was taken a year later. It showed Myra standing next to her parents, all three of them smiling genuinely, not performing, not pretending, just a family, broken and healed, standing together. And in the corner of the photo, lying at their feet, was Max, the dog who taught a judge that justice without compassion was incomplete, the dog who'd shown a silenced girl that her voice mattered, the dog who demonstrated, through his simple, steadfast presence, that sometimes the most powerful interventions look nothing like authority or expertise. Sometimes they just look like love. The family case became known in legal circles as the Max precedent. Law schools began teaching it. Judicial conferences highlighted it. Academic papers were written about it. But what mattered most wasn't the legal principle. It was the transformation of three human beings who'd learned that truth wasn't something that had to be extracted through pain. Truth could be spoken and heard and honored. All it required was for someone to say, "I see you. I'm here with you. You don't have to do this alone." One old dog had said that without words, and in doing so, he changed the entire trajectory of a broken family, a transformed judge, and a system that was slowly learning to balance rigor with compassion. This is the story of Max and Myra and Judge. It is a story about what happens when someone, or someone with fur and four legs, decides that presence matters more than protocol, and how that simple decision can ripple outward and transform everything.